Hey there everybody, it's Ram here and welcome to the Blender 2.8 PC Parts Guide. This guide should also work if you're looking for Blender 2.8.1 or 2.8.2. But without any further ado, let's get into it. Now, a couple things here first. So for this PC, I'm not going to be showing you some ultra high-end Blender PC, and I'm not going to be showing you some super basic entry-level PC. This is going to be sort of middle of the road. If you're doing professional stuff, this might be a little bit closer to the lower end. However, if you're just a hobbyist, then this PC should be just fine for you. I'll be showing where you can pull some stuff back a little bit if you want, if your budget doesn't quite allow for this about $1,000 PC, or if you want to spend a little bit extra, where you can go ahead and do that. Also stay tuned for the end, because if you're interested at all in some really high-end computing for Blender or just some really cool PC parts, then you might be interested in that. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get to the first part of our computer. So for starters, the CPU, this is the thing that you're going to be basing most of your build around. At least this is where I normally start with builds. So for Blender, what you're looking for in a CPU is you want something that's capable, because if you go over your VRAM limit, which is your video memory limit, then your CPU is really what you're going to want to be using. But let me take a step back here a little bit to explain what I mean by video memory. So most of the time in Blender, you don't want to be doing your rendering on your CPU. It's way less efficient. You don't want to do that. Really what you want to be doing is rendering on your GPU, which we will get to later. So the CPU is more of a backup for rendering. However, you still want something that can hold its own. Now, you don't need the absolute fastest CPU. Again, Blender is mostly going to be something that you want to use on your GPU. So, and if you're not going to be using your GPU, you're going to know why. So if you don't know why, then you want to be using your GPU instead of your CPU. Now, like I said, you don't need the best CPU ever. What I've picked out here is more of a mid-range CPU. This is a second generation Ryzen chip. I know that third generation is out. It's been out for a little while now, and I was actually waiting till I had a lot of information on those chips to release this video. But at 200, no, not even 200 bucks. You can see here on Newegg, it's 180 bucks for an 8-core 16-thread chip. That is an amazing steal. This is going to give you all the PCIe lanes that you'll need for most people. It's going to give you all the memory channels. It's going to give you just all the expansion and power that you need. Not to mention, you can fit it in a motherboard that will take the Ryzen 3000 series, which gives you a lot more performance there. Now, one thing to think about with Blender, if you are on a stricter budget, then you can certainly go with, I would recommend a Ryzen 2600, not 2600X, but the Ryzen 2600. And if you have more of a budget, you may want to consider Intel, and this is the reason why. While Blender's rendering does not really take advantage of the CPU very well, when you are still working on your models in Blender, you're gonna need some single-threaded performance. Now, the second generation Ryzen chips are no laughing matter, but if you have the money and the need for doing a lot of very high poly work, for doing simulations especially, then having something like a third generation Ryzen chip, or maybe even an Intel chip, could be beneficial for you. Reason being, not only does Blender use the CPU more there, but also while Blender is heavily multi-threaded which means that when it says how many cores and threads that it has, it does use those, a lot of those, very well, but only in tasks like rendering. When it comes to tasks like baking or going and playing back simulations, or just generating the simulations in the first place, moving large amounts of geometry, then you're going to need the single core performance. There's many different instances there where Blender is quite lightly threaded, and that is unfortunate. Hopefully it will be fixed in the future, but right now, as of 2.8.0, 2.80, that is the case. I haven't seen any big updates for that coming along for 2.81, so I wouldn't expect that in that version of Blender. However, if you're on like 2.83 or 84, I may go and do a little bit of research on your own and just see where Blender has advanced in that area. But for the most part, I do professional Blender work all the time, and a chip like this, or the 3600 that I'm running in my machine right now, so that's a 3rd generation 6-core Ryzen chip, works absolutely fine. Though if I would have seen this deal, I probably would have bought this instead. However, there are a few caveats, but we'll get to those in a second. So next, after your CPU, we want to go ahead and look at our motherboard. Obviously, since we chose a Ryzen chip, we're going to be choosing a AMD motherboard. AMD chip, AMD motherboard. For most of you, that's probably obvious, but I don't know who's going to be watching the video, so I want to give the information. Now, I'm going to be choosing an X470 motherboard. Now, here's the thing. If you are going to be going down the Ryzen 2nd generation option, there's nothing wrong with that. It'll work quite well, but you do need to make sure that this motherboard I know has it. I went to the motherboard's manufacturer's website and looked it up. This motherboard will be updated for 3rd generation. Plus, you can see right here, this one actually says that it supports 3rd gen, so that's great. And you also need to go and check the number of VRMs. I'm not going to go into the details of VRMs, but it has to do with these little guys here. How many of these little guys does it have? The more, the better. The reason being, that is what powers your CPU, and that especially for the bigger Ryzen chips, like if you want to get a 12-core Ryzen chip or the new 16-core that hasn't quite been released yet, then you're going to want the extra VRM so that it can power the chip appropriately. However, most of the time you don't need to go that high, so if you're just going for maybe an upgrade to the 3rd gen 3700 that's an 8-core, or if you're going up to the even the 12-core isn't going to quite push it, but especially if it's just the 8-core, which I would say most of the time is about as far as you need to go, at least on the AMD platform, then you're going to be absolutely fine with a good X470 motherboard. Reason that it's X470, not B450. Some B450s have a lot of power behind them, and so that could be fine, but you do want to research that. But X470s are more likely to provide that. Also, X470s normally come with more of these PCIe lanes down here. Now, this has to do a lot with the graphics card that we're going to be looking at later, or how Blender uses graphics cards. So, Blender renders primarily on its graphics card, which I guess that's not entirely a true statement. You want to render primarily on your graphics card. I regularly at work on a Xeon system, a somewhat nice Xeon system, and I've worked on a variety of other systems. Graphics cards always, per dollar, unless you get into high-end quadros, basically always outperform their CPU counterparts. And so if you can get a good enough graphics card, then you want to have basically as many of those as you can get in your system. Now, I'm not talking about SLI, I'm not talking about Crossfire. Blender will use those cards individually, so you just need to make sure that they can slot in. One of the possible advantages to going with a newer motherboard, an X570 motherboard, and a newer processor, is, at least with AMD, you get the 4th generation of PCIe. These are PCIe slots. And that allows for more speed, which means that you might have more compatibility down the road if you want to upgrade your graphics cards later on. So that could be something that you want to look into. However, for most people, the vast majority of people, you will not be using more than 2 cards. And the 2nd generation of Ryzen on an X470 motherboard will be just fine for that. However, the X470 does allow you to go to the 3rd. It's PCIe Generation 3, not Generation 4, but that for the most part will be fine. And for this sort of a budget would be fine. If you are someone that's like, oh no, I just need to get the most performance out of Blender, you're doing this professionally, I'd heavily recommend that you get a HED T-chip, a high-end desktop chip, so AMD's Threadripper series, which means that your motherboard can have more PCIe lanes and can support more graphics cards in it. Or one of Intel's offerings, because Intel is going to be offering some fairly good stuff here soon. It looks like they're going to have some fairly competitive products, so you might want to look into that. But if you think that you're ever going to be using more than 3 graphics cards at once, you want to look into those options, not the more consumer options here. And that has to do with, back to the CPU, that's where you'd start, and then you'd move on to your motherboard. But the PCIe slots are very important to watch out for. Now, for the RAM slots here, because we're not done with our motherboard yet. So another thing that you want to keep in mind here is for expandability. And so really you want to have 4 RAM slots. Now, almost any X470 motherboard would have that. However, some B450 motherboards, if you're going that route, because you need something a little bit cheaper, which again is fine, but look out for the things that I told you. You're still going to want to make sure that you have 4 RAM slots, because a lot of times people will be doing more than just Blender. Like, they'll be doing video editing as well. And while Blender, you want to try to keep it so that you're below whatever the VRAM is on your graphics card. Your main system RAM, when you're editing videos or whatnot, you could very easily get over, 2 8 gig sticks, which is a pretty normal amount to start with. 16 gigs in total. That's pretty normal to start with, and especially for Blender, that's all that you really need. But if you discover later on that you need to do more, or you're doing something like motion tracking in Blender, where you have to cache a whole bunch of frames, then you're gonna need more RAM, and having those extra slots will allow you to do that much more easily. It gives you more of an upgrade path, which since again Blender isn't very CPU heavy, there are a few points that can be nice to have, but for most instances it's not CPU heavy. You're probably going to be able to stick with this platform for a while and just be upgrading your GPUs. So you do want to keep that in mind. Other than that, with the motherboard, if you want to be using some of these M.2 slots down here, the most B450 motherboards will have at least one. X470 motherboards have a couple of them, but you want to make sure that you're not running into conflicts with using the PCIe lanes for your graphics cards. Now, if you're only going to have 1, maybe 2 graphics cards, normally you can get away with that. Read the details of your motherboard, but it is still something to keep in mind, because you don't want to be like, yeah, I'm building my new system, I got both my graphics cards in here, it's great, put in the M.2 drive, why isn't one of the graphics cards working? Well, that's because these M.2 drives will use PCIe lanes, which means that some of these slots may not work. That being said, I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting an NVMe an NVMe drive here for boot or storage. A good SSD works just fine, and Blender doesn't need that extra speed. If you're doing something like Premiere, then you definitely might want an NVMe drive, because Premiere loves to work off of the storage that you have. It does load a lot into the memory, the RAM that you have up here, but there's multiple different instances where it's working off of your main storage. So that might be important for you, but for Blender, it's not that important. I would value getting the PCIe lanes for your graphics cards over getting the NVMe drive. Now, let's get to the thing that I've been talking about a lot, which is the graphics card. Ordinarily, I go for the RAM next, but I've been talking about it so much, we might as well go here. So for the graphics card, this is one of the biggest pieces with Blender, since most of the time you're going to be rendering on it. Now, most of my expertise is in the Cycles render engine in Blender, which, if you're brand new to Blender, is the main render engine that you're going to want to be rendering anything fancy out of, anything professional out of. Cycles is a very, very good render. It is very accurate, but it definitely does take some processing power to compute. So what I recommend for a graphics card for that is a RTX 2060. And you can see right here, this is a very simple Gigabyte RTX 2060. You don't need some super ultra fancy RTX card or whatnot. But the reasons that I would recommend the RTX 2060 over any of the other NVIDIA or AMD options is really its price to performance. The RTX 2060 is only $400, which is a lot, but considering graphics card prices nowadays, that's pretty good. Now, another feature that is really important here is the RTX aspect of it. Now, Blender 2.80 doesn't really support these RTX cores very well. In fact, it doesn't do anything with them. Specifically, NVIDIA refers to them as RT cores. However, in most likely 2.82, possibly in 2.81, but it looks like most likely 2.82, these will be implemented a lot more, which means that the AMD cards that are out right now that don't have any of these features, these ray tracing features that the RTX cards have, are going to leave you at a very big disadvantage. The preliminary sort of renders looks like in some instances you can get twice the performance out of just having these RT cores on. So that is a really, really big deal that you're definitely going to want. And again, for the reason that I'm choosing the RTX 2060 Super out of the NVIDIA stack is because of the price point to performance. It's not like an RTX 2060, it's an RTX 2060 Super. Now the Super, what it does is it gives you a higher clock speed and it gives you a lot more CUDA cores. So though right now this isn't implemented super well within Blender, there's a few little, not exactly bugs, but not some good optimization. It definitely, as time goes on, it'll get more and more optimized. Then also the other big thing, if you didn't hear anything else what I was saying about the graphics cards, then you want to hear this. The big thing is, unlike the RTX 2060, the Super has 8 gigs of VRAM. That's going to be really, really important. One of the biggest things that's going to hurt you when it comes to rendering isn't the power of your graphics card, it's going to be the amount of VRAM on your graphics card. At least as you get better, that'll definitely be an issue. Reason being, if you run out of VRAM on your graphics card, then you have to go to your CPU, and that's going to be so much slower. That really will stop you from doing a lot of different things. At least for me personally, if I gotta sit there for 20, 30, 40 minutes just to see a preview of what this is going to look like before I change it again immediately because it's not quite what I want, then that's not really worth it to me. I want to be able to see a preview a lot more quickly than that. You know, if it takes 1 minute, okay, fine, for a simple little partial render preview. That's okay. And even almost any GPU will do that for you, any modern GPU, where a CPU, that very likely could not happen. It could take 20, 30 minutes to do that with a budget CPU. And that's why the VRAM is so important. If you're looking for a card that is a lot cheaper than this, then I would recommend the Radeon RX 500. Hey, future RAM here. Quick little edit is that I actually meant to say the RX 580 or 570, preferably the 580 8 gig edition, maybe even the RX 590, not the 500. 580 or 590 8 gig edition, not 500. If I say 500 again, I mean 580 or 590. That's it. Back to old me. Now I know it doesn't have the RTX cores on it, the RT cores, but it's a very good solid card, and if you get the 8 gig edition, then you won't run into that VRAM buffer for a long time. In work, I have never run into that VRAM buffer. In a few stupid things that I was doing it here at home with my 1080 that's got 8 gigs of VRAM on it, I have run into that a couple of times, but you just tweak back the settings a little bit, or at least I did, so it wasn't stupid numbers of polygons and generated terrain and other textures, and it was fine. I really didn't need that, and if it was for a project that I was working on, there are ways that I could have separated that out and still fit within my 8 gig VRAM buffer, where if you're down at like 4 gigs, that can be a lot harder to do. Your scenes have to be a lot more simple to be able to do that, or you again have to go to your CPU, which is just going to take you forever to render. Now for options to go up higher, a good step up from this right now would probably be a 2080, reason being it's more optimized. However, if you're watching this in the future, then the 2070 Super is a pretty good option. I would not recommend the 2080 Super. That is not nearly as much of a bump as the 2060 to 2060 Super and the 2070 Super. The 2070 is not a good option right now because it is so close to the 2060. The 2070 Super, though it's not super well optimized at the moment, that is a fairly big bump over the 2070, and so jumping from Super to Super is what I'd recommend from the 60 to 70 series, while then the 80 series, I would really just recommend the 2080. Now, if you're looking for something even better, if you're running into VRAM issues, then I would first recommend that you go to the 2080 Ti. Now that's got 11 gigs of VRAM, so for a lot of people that's going to cover everything they need to do. However, if you feel like you're going to run out of VRAM at 11 gigs, then I would recommend going to the RTX Titan. In fact, before going to a Quadro, I would recommend last generation's Titan. Quadros are far more expensive than the performance that they give, especially in Blender. If you're doing something like CAD work and simulations in some of those programs, then yes, you want to get a Quadro because they are optimized for that sort of workflow. They are also much more precise. But for anything that's just art related in Blender, Blender is not something that I would use for specific like engineering tasks or fluid dynamics to simulate how this weather system would work. Blender doesn't really do that. So you don't need the extra little bit of precision that those Quadros give you. And for the massive price that those Quadros command, they give you very little performance in comparison. The Titan series is far better per dollar, especially the RTX Titan that has a lot of VRAM in it. It's got 24 gigs of VRAM in it, and per dollar that will get you far more performance. Now let's take a step back a little bit. Since we've been talking so much about VRAM, let's go to our normal RAM. Again, normally I would have done this before the graphics card, but I've been talking about it so much already, we might as well have gotten to the graphics card. Now for your RAM, since I am using a AMD system, I recommend you get some faster RAM with tighter timings and a lower cast latency. Now 1618, 1836 is okay. It's not great, but it is okay, especially at RAM that is rated at 30,000 megahertz. That's some fairly good RAM, and that'll work fairly well on Ryzen systems, on AMD systems. So the reason that's important for AMD systems is especially since I'm recommending a second generation Ryzen chip, there's part of the CPU that's linked to the RAM speed, and so your CPU will perform better if your RAM is faster. Third generation, that's not quite as bad, however, it's still there. Now, the lower the timings and cast latency, the better your compatibility will be. If the timings are tight enough, and the cast latency is low enough, then you might even be able to overclock this RAM even more quite stably, and then your CPU performance might go up even a little bit extra. than what it would with just setting this to factory defaults. I'm not going to go into the details of timings and why those are important, and CAS latency and how all that works. If you want, you can go and look up something on timings on RAM and CAS latency, but that's a little bit out of the scope of this video. Now, what is in the scope of this video is I have two 8 gig sticks. You don't want to get just one 16 gig stick. You might be thinking, oh, I could be doing a lot more later. Right now I only need 16 gigs, but I'll get a 16 gig stick. That way I can go all the way up to 64 gigs. You don't want to do that because your CPU has what's called memory channels. So it basically can parallelize the work that it's doing for the RAM. This is a very brief overview, but that's sort of how it works. And so by using 2 sticks, you can use both channels, which will help your CPU perform much better instead of having to move stuff from kind of like one channel to the other. It's not really how it works, but if that helps you get the idea that it's extra moving for the CPU to do and it takes more time, then that's good, because it does take more time. So that's why you want to make sure that you have at least 2 sticks that you're putting in right away. I wouldn't recommend going any lower than 8, because then you're just going to have a lot of problems with Windows and everything in general. However, 16 gigs is pretty good. I run 16 gigs on my system, and I do a fair amount of video editing and Blender work. And so that's good for everything that I do personally, or some of the small contract work that I take outside of my normal job. Now, moving on from there, your storage. What are you going to store everything on? Well, a hard drive is really great, but they're super, super slow and just plain annoying. So I recommend a nice Team Group SSD is fine. You can have Kingston, you can have Samsung, whatever. The thing that you want to look for is you don't want to have it say that it's TLC or QLC on it. What that means is triple layer chip and quad layer chip. Triple layer chip isn't quite as bad, but quad layer chip, even though they normally have fairly good warranties and everything, the way that SSDs work, the more layers that are on the chip, the slower that they are, and the more likely that they are to die. Now, SSDs work in a way so that they probably, it's not like they're just going to die all of a sudden, but I would trust a MLC chip, a multi-layer chip, which means it's just 2 layers instead of triple or quad, to last a lot longer. The MLC chip would probably last a lot longer. I would use that on professional shoots when I do movies and stuff. Then I would trust that sort of data with backups in MLC drive. So really what you want to look for is an SSD that's either SLC or MLC. If it says it's 3D VNAND, that really doesn't mean either or. But you do want to try to avoid the TLC and the QLC when you're looking for SSDs. But I would recommend an SSD. An SSD is just so much faster than a hard drive. And they're pretty cheap now. So you can see here, 512 gig hard drive. I ran on a 512 gig or 512 gig SSD that's right here. I ran on a 500 gig hard drive for 3 or 4 years. So this will be good for the start, and then you can always go and throw in a hard drive for mass storage later, or some more SSDs. That motherboard had a lot of different SATA ports on it, and almost any motherboard that you get is going to have at least 6 SATA slots on it, so you can store a lot of drives in there. I think that's everything for the SSD, so let's move on to our power supply. Now, power supplies are not something that you really want to skimp on. This system I'm building out so it can supply 2 of almost any graphics card on the market, where if you want 3 graphics cards, you might want a little bit more power than this. Now, one of the things to watch out for with power supplies is you want to make sure that you have this 80 plus rating. Now, I find 80 plus bronze to be just fine. However, some people like 80 plus silver or gold or platinum or titanium. Basically what it means, when you get up to titanium, you're looking at like 90% efficiency. They're more likely to last longer. They're more likely to deal with surges that come in from just random stuff that happens at your house or your apartment complex, which is fairly common, and they'll just deal with that a little bit better. But I've never really had a problem with a bronze power supply from a reputable company. Roswell's pretty good. They're not the best. EVGA is also pretty good. You've got a variety of other manufacturers that you can go and look up. When you see the name, you just copy the name, paste it into Google, and look at some reviews of their stuff, see how good they are, see how long they've been around. But for the most part, if you have an 80 plus bronze rating, then it'll probably be a good power supply. If you know what you're looking at for power supplies, then an 80, I would never go less than an 80 plus rating, but sometimes you can get away with just an 80 plus rated power supply. Though those are not my top recommendation. The power supply is not something to skimp on. If you're just going with one graphics card, unless it's a very high-end graphics card, the amount of power wise, a 650 watt power supply would probably be just fine for you. Just one, 2070, that'd probably be just fine for what you're doing. I would feel very, very happy with recommending that. However, if you're going to 2 or possibly even 3 graphics cards, which again with Blender is totally possible. You don't have to SLI them. You just slot them in and it'll use them. I would recommend going with, for 2 graphics cards, at least a 750 watt power supply, depending on what graphics cards they are. Like if they're the 2080s or especially 2080 Ti's, you need to go up to an 850 watt, maybe even a little bit higher. Now that's just for 2. For 3, you definitely need to be at 1,000. Just for safety, I would not run 3 graphics cards on, unless they were lower end. If they were lower end, I might run them on 900 watts. But for the most part, by the time that you're spending enough money to get 3 graphics cards, I would not run it on anything less than a 1,000 watt power supply. And there are some PSU calculators. Most power supplies are called PSUs, not UPSs. That's different. That's like a giant battery for your computer. But PSUs, you can look for PSU calculator, and that'll help you calculate how big of a power supply you need for your system. But for this one, I'm going with an 850 watt power supply, and I think that should be fine for 2 graphics cards. The other final thing that you want to look out here for your power supply is the number of PCIe connectors that it has. It normally says that it's VGA connectors. If we actually look down here, then I'll show you where they're at for this one. If the page will actually show me. Looks like it's not going to. Let me just refresh here. Technical difficulties. Yes, I'm doing this all in one take because I want to. But if we scroll down here, so this one actually does say PCIe Express connector, but sometimes on the power supply itself, it will say VGA. I don't know enough to know exactly why they do that, but they do. And you can see here that I have 6+2 pins. Now what that is, on your graphics card, it will have either a 6-pin power connector or it will have a 8-pin power connector, and the 6+2 works on that 8-pin. And a lot of graphics cards will have either 2 6-pins, a 6-pin and an 8-pin, or 2 8-pins, especially if you're at the higher end. And so these 4 connectors here make sure that I can do 2 graphics cards. Now, I do actually have a 750 watt power supply that has 6 of these, but remember that's pushing it a little bit, and I wouldn't really recommend that you do that. 3 graphics cards and a 750 watt power supply, no. You probably are going to want to have at least, again, an 850, if not a 900, probably 1,000 though. But you can use the PSU calculators to figure that out specifically for yourself. Now, let's hop on to the last item that we need for our computer, and that is our case. You don't need a fancy case for Blender. It's not going to make it run faster. You want to make sure that you have some ventilation and stuff in there, but especially starting out, just having the fan in the back, the CPU cooler that comes with your graphics card, especially your graphics card, but even your CPU for the AMD systems are going to be just fine. So the fans that come in this DIY PC case should be totally fine. It's got a nice side panel on it, and you can see there, the big thing that you want to look at for PC cases is you want to look at these PCIe slots that are here. Let me try to get a better view of this so I can show you guys. And so here we go. So these are the PCIe slots. Now this first one here is covered up, but remember on my motherboard that's not a problem because I've got the NVMe drive that's right there. In fact, I'll show you here real fast. You can see the NVMe drive is right there. That's going to take up my first PCIe slot. So that doesn't really matter. My graphics card's going to sit right here. And then I know that I have room for my very next graphics card right there. Now for a third graphics card, that wouldn't really work, but if I want a network card or something else in there, then I've got room for that. If you do want a third graphics card, you want to make sure that you have enough PCIe slots here to support, or physical little brackets here to support having all of those graphics cards. So what you very well might have to do is just go and count here at your motherboard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and just figure out how many of these actual slots that you're going to need. And again, you'd have to see, can you actually remove that solid PCIe bracket that's right there? Because if you can't, then you're not going to be able to put a graphics card there. So all things to consider when you're looking for your case, but again, it doesn't have to be fancy. This one isn't the cheapest one on Newegg, but it's pretty close to it and it looks kind of nice. So let's go ahead and just do a quick overview here. So case, just see how many brackets you have for your PCIe slots, make sure that that all fits there. And you can make sure that it's the right ATX. This is an ATX mid tower, so you want to make sure that that fits inside there. Then your motherboard here, again, you can match the ATX. Okay, you're fine. Is it a mid, micro, extended ATX? But then the big things here are number of PCIe slots and number of PCIe lanes that it's allowed to those PCIe slots, because some of those lanes will not be true 16x lanes. So look that up. Then also, does it have enough power delivery for your CPU? If it's an X470, then you'll probably be fine. If you're looking at Intel, then you want to get at least one of their mid-range boards, because that'll be able to supply the power a bit more cleanly to your CPU. That's going to help out better. Their low-end boards aren't going to have those PCIe slots, and they're also not going to be quite as good for your CPU. If you have an overclocked CPU for Intel, then you really have to have a higher end board. For AMD, while they all can be overclocked, the higher end boards are going to allow you to support those better CPUs later on. For your graphics card, the VRAM is the biggest thing. However, I recommend getting an RTX card, not an NVIDIA card, an RTX card. There is a difference there. I'll make that distinction now, and since I didn't before. An RTX card would be really, really good, because that's going to be implemented in a big way probably in the next few months, if not a little bit longer than that. Now for your power supply, don't skimp on this. If you're going to err on the side of caution, this is definitely a place to do it, because if this goes out, then your system goes out, and that can get very, very expensive very, very fast. Use a PSU calculator to calculate the number of wattage, or the number of watts that you need for your computer and your specific build. Also check the number of PCIe connectors or VGA connectors on the power supply to make sure, even though it has enough wattage, it has enough physical connectors to work. For your RAM, you want to go and make sure that you're running at least in dual channel. And that's for most systems. If you're looking at an HEDT chip, then you might have more than 2 channels, so you might want to start off with more than 2 sticks of RAM. But look at that on your CPU. When you're getting your CPU, they will all have at least 2 channels. If it's a super, super high-end system, then you might have more, and you want to fill up all those channels to begin with. And then also with your motherboard, make sure that you have room to expand later, unless you're just going balls to the walls from the beginning. For the CPU, you don't have to have a super high-end CPU for Blender. A decent one is a good idea. I would recommend to have it at the bare minimum a 2600. You can go lower, certainly, if you're on a very strict budget, but the 2600 is really about the lowest that I would ever want to go for a Blender system. The 2700 is a very good choice, but if you're going to be doing lots of simulations and you have the money for it, it might be good to go with an Intel system, though a third generation Ryzen system is also going to perform very similarly to that. So you might save a lot of money by going with a third gen Ryzen system over anything that Intel offers. In fact, you probably will. So I'd probably go there. However, if you get the money for it, good Intel chip might serve you a little bit better for lots of simulations, or very, very high poly count models and scenes. Now for your storage, NVMe drive, not really needed. The speed isn't going to help Blender at all. If you want to do that, make sure you're watching your PCIe lanes. However, a good SSD that is SLC NAND or MLC NAND is probably the best. TLC is acceptable, though that would not at all be my first choice. And QLC I would pretty much avoid. And that's about it. You can see here you get a couple of extra games and stuff with it. But that's the PC parts guide for Blender 2.80, probably 81 and 82 as well. If you were looking for specifically Eevee stuff, this is mostly going to apply to Eevee. One big caveat is that Eevee will probably just use one GPU, at least as right now is concerned. For right now, Eevee mostly just uses one GPU, so just get the best gaming graphics card that you can for Eevee. It's basically like Unreal Engine or Unity, except it's made for doing more animations and stuff, not building a game. Now for the big thing that I told you to wait for until the very, very end. So at my work, I'm building a very, very nice Blender machine. It's been taking a little bit longer for it to get approved than my bosses and me would have liked, but stay tuned because I will be running some real benchmarks on that. I will have some real photos of that machine, and let's just say it is definitely a 4 GPU system, and man, I wish I could have those 4 GPUs. They are good. So stay tuned. I'll try to release something on that as soon as I can. But other than that, see you guys next time. Leave comments in the comment section below. Bye.